Hi, good evening. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm Jackie Lembeck. I'm one of the partners here at McAndrews, Mehalick, Connolly, Hulse and Ryan. And I'm here with Alison. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Awesome. Hi, all. I'm Alison Kahney. I'm also a special ed attorney at McAndrews, Mehalick, Connolly, Hulse and Ryan. I am really excited to talk with you all about some report cards and IEP progress.
Yeah, so this is a topic that I think is so important for families to be able to like really do a deep dive. You get reports all the time, but how often do you really think about how should you be using them? How do they track your child's progress? And what do you do if you have concerns? So that's what we're going to be going over tonight. We do have some slides for you. We had a little bit of difficulty getting them up in the screen share before, so I'm going to work on that for just a moment, and then we are getting started. Okay, Allison, let me know if you can see that. That looks good to you.
I can see it. It doesn't look like it's in presenting mode quite yet. Um, it's sort of, but it'll work if it's, going to get stuck there.
Okay, well, as long as you could see the content, the only thing is
Okay,
that with this view, I won't be able to monitor the chat. So if you see anything, if you could just bring that to my attention as well, in case we have
absolutely.
any questions. But otherwise, I think we can get started. All right, so I'm going to
Perfect.
advance this to the next.
Okay, it's not advancing.
Not seeing the reviewing report cards.
I'm not yet. I'm still seeing the initial screen with all the slides on the left, and it says enable editing at the top.
Okay, well, rather than hold this up, why don't
Mhm.
we, because you have a copy that you can see as well?
Yep, absolutely.
Why
We
don't
can
we
run right
work
through
off
it.
of that? For any attendee, we can send you a copy of the slides afterwards. So just let us know. You can email us. We'll put our emails in at the end of this into the chat. And so that you can email us, you can get a copy of this. But everything that we are going to go over is really what we're going to verbally present anyway.
Absolutely. All right, perfect. Well, I'll kick us off with report cards. Report cards are something that we are all used to seeing, but we hope that we can shed some light on, as Jackie said, some different ways we can utilize them, and some strategies in really using them to track progress of your students. So first, I want to go over how to understand the type of report card that your child is being issued. We've recently been seeing something called standards-based report cards. And these measure a student's proficiency in specific skills rather than like a letter grade at the end of the marking period for the core subjects that we're used to seeing. So the skills that are measured are typically essential skills that students should learn in each subject area at a particular grade level. So rather than just like reading math, science, social studies, and you get an A through an F in those, we'll see it broken down into much more skills. And the uh, tracking or the grade that students are getting is something along the lines of applying the skill, meeting the skill, approaching the skill, or enabling the skill. And different districts seem to be kind of rolling these out at different periods for different groups, but we often see them for younger students. So, for instance, I saw one school district recently do K through first grade with these standards-based report cards, and then another was actually kindergarten all the way through fifth. So it really just depends. And I think the big takeaway here is to be aware of what type of report card your student is receiving. And if you're not sure, reach out to the teacher or whoever you're in contact with at the school, just so you can understand what sort of report card you're getting, and then you can better understand what it really means. And then more generally speaking, when reviewing your report cards, we have a few things that we would like parents to keep in mind, or we would recommend that you do. So we recommend that you compare report cards to previous marking period report cards and previous year report cards. We find this a good way to sort of track, monitor areas of growth and also areas that might need a little more attention and support. This is really helpful if you do have the standards-based report card because it's broken down into smaller sections. It's often easier to kind of see the areas that need more focus or a little more support. So that's a great way to kind of track. Another way is to consider the feedback that you received at a parent-teacher conference or any that a teacher is giving kind of at any point. I like to see if there's any surprises in the report card, anything you weren't expecting that a teacher hadn't shared or someone working with your child hadn't shared before. It's kind of a good check and balance to see, what is actually happening. And if the report card isn't reflecting it, maybe you can get some more information from a teacher. The third thing we would recommend that you kind of review in conjunction with the report card is if the report card is matching what you see on Schoology or your online service. For instance, if Schoology has been showing really low grades or just marks all marking period, and then suddenly the report card shows an A for your student, there might be some underlying work completion issues there if your student hadn't been turning in assignments throughout the marking period. Maybe Schoology was reflecting that, and then assignments were all turned in at the end, and they were done well. And it's reflected in the report card as a passing grade or a good grade. Still might be something to look out for because, it might be an area of support that we could kind of work on. So I think considering all of these markers in conjunction with report cards really help give a fuller picture and help determine where we can improve supports for students or just kind of keep our eye out for areas that might be exacerbated down the line or things like that. On the other hand, I think report cards may actually fill in the blanks that we are not seeing elsewhere. So if a student is doing really well in class, the teacher feedback is amazing. But then when it comes time to take the test, pieces aren't necessarily fitting together. The report card might reflect that based, if it's a letter grade and it's based on the test, the report card might show, hey, we need a little more help in piecing it all together. So really, the point here is report cards are a great tool, but they're not the only tool. Some other markers to review and to consider when you're also reviewing these report cards are IEP progress reports, which we'll touch on a little bit more later. Like I mentioned, teacher feedback. It's also really great to kind of listen to what the child or student is saying and, monitor demeanor and other sort of interests and that kind of thing. You can look at the IEP itself and see if that's changing over time. And just anything you can, really observe in the way the student is approaching school. It's really helpful information. I think the final point is just that education is not just academics, it's kind of the whole student, and that includes, the student's emotional well-being, their interests outside of academics, and all of those pieces are make up the child. So I think, report cards are great, but not the only piece. And that is all I have on
Absolutely.
report card.
And we so often hear that, there's this pushback against identifying a student, either with, as a student who needs an IEP or a 504, just based on the grades. Grades are not the only thing to look at. So a student can absolutely have strong grades, but that does not mean that that is not a student who is struggling in some areas or a student with a disability. We really have to look, like Alison was saying, at the whole student. Is tremendous amount of anxiety that is caused by being able to, keep up these grades? Is the student doing much work than his or her peers in order to achieve those grades? Does the student have other, deficits that are really impacting them at school, like social skills or something that maybe wouldn't be seen as readily in the report card? For students who are
Jackie, I'm just
not
going to jump
identified
in
yet, they
really
sure.
quickly. I'm so sorry. I just noticed in the chat that Somebody might have a microphone on that is kind of causing a big echo. So if everyone could please mute themselves, that would be very helpful. And thank you for shouting that out.
And please put back in the chat if it's not cured, because if there's something that we can do on our end, we absolutely want to try to do that. We're going to switch focus here a little bit to talk about MTSS data. So MTSS is multi-tiered system of support. And generally speaking, this is how schools can support students where they are in their journey. It is not special education. We'll talk about that. But there are many students who are receiving support through MTSS, and its data should go hand in hand with reviewing report card data. However, what we find is that there are a lot of families who feel very out of the loop when their child is receiving these services, and they may not be very clear on what their child is receiving, what the data that's collected show from MTSS, and how they should be viewing that alongside the report card or the other information that they're getting. So that's what we're going to break down here. So MTSS, as I mentioned, is multi-tiered system of support, and it breaks students into 3 tiers. And in those 3 tiers, there is tier 1, which is all students generally, and that's going to be school-wide practices, like their school-wide positive behavior support. And then there's also targeted small group intervention for at-risk students, or what we would call tier 2. And then finally, tier 3. Tier 3 is the least populous group. It's the students who need the most intensive support and those who may be most likely to need special education support. However, it's really important to note that there may be students in any of these tiers who do require an evaluation for an IEP or a 504 plan. So some examples, just to kind of make it more concrete, for tier 1, we talked about might be like the school-wide positive behavior support initiatives that every student's going to participate in, school-wide social emotional curriculum that everyone will participate in. Tier 2 is going to get a little bit more targeted to a specific area that a student may be struggling with. Might be like a lunch bunch for going over some social skills. It might be some small group reading or math support. It might be a quick check-in or check-out with a teacher for a student who is having more of those executive functioning deficits, things like, organization, work completion. And then tier 3 is going to get more intensive than that. It might be more individual and individualized, so individual counseling. It may involve a partnership with a mental health agency to provide some services, or it may even include more intensive academic or one-on-one support for that student. MTSS is general education. It is not special education, and it is not a replacement for special education. So there will be some students who start off as receiving support through tier 2 or tier 3, and may eventually go on to receive special education support. Really important here, MTSS cannot be used to delay or deny a special education evaluation when one is needed. So there are a lot of times that schools may suggest to parents that they put off an initial evaluation to see how MTSS works for the student. That could be reasonable in some circumstances, but it is not a rule. And if you feel that your child needs an evaluation, you do not have to wait and go through any, prereq period of weeks in MTSS before you can get that evaluation. If you want an evaluation, you should request it in writing and get the school's response to it. Data is a big piece of MTSS. That's the whole point, is that we should be collecting data and seeing whether the child is responding to the intervention that is being provided. And if the child's able to kind of get back onto grade level and meet expectations with that little bit of support, that's great. But if the child is still showing that there are some deficits, then the child may be moving into a more intensive level, like going from tier 2 to tier 3, or maybe getting evaluated for special education services. Some things that I would ask if my child were those services would be like how long have the services been in place? If it's in a group, how big is the group? What is it focused on? How often is the instruction provided? And are there any specific like curricula or programs that are used? What you want to see is that the answer is really targeted to fit the need. So if there's a need in oral reading fluency because that is low for a particular child, but the other areas of reading aren't as much, you want to see that the service that's provided is based on practicing skills that are going to improve that oral reading fluency. And you want to know that it is often enough and supportive enough to help see that growth. How do you know if there's growth? You ask for the data. So the schools should be taking data on this, and you should be able to see and review that with them as well. If you still have questions, a couple things that you might want to consider. You can request your child's records. Parents or caregivers are able to request records under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA. So families can get a complete copy of the student's records, which should include the educational data that's been taken for that student. You can request a meeting to discuss the progress, have it explained to you, go over the data that you have been presented, ask questions about it. And you can also ask for regular updates on your child's progress. So you do not have to wait until, the next report card. If you have questions, you should be able to, within reason, ask those questions and communicate throughout the year, because, report cards are only so frequent, and there's a lot that, may need to be in place for your child in the interim period.
Okay, so on a similar note, we will talk about IEP progress monitoring, which, sort of follows what Jackie was saying, where we need to collect the data to understand what's going on. So, I was talking about report cards earlier, and those are issued for every student. We're used to seeing them every marking period. But IEP progress monitoring is something that a student gets by way of having an IEP. So this is the way that we can track how the IEP is going, essentially. So appropriate progress monitoring tells us whether revisions need to be made to the student's programming, essentially. So it's extremely important in assessing whether the student is advancing towards their IEP goals. It's one of the best ways that we can determine if the supports that they're receiving are actually working and being effective, or whether we need some tweaks to the services being provided or the way they're being implemented, all different things. Otherwise we are really left to guesswork and just kind of, feeling how it's going, when we really want to see the quantified data to see the student's growth. And that way we don't have to be guessing. So unfortunately, progress monitoring is often done in a less than ideal way. And we really like to see some specific things in progress monitoring so that we are, accurately tracking a student's progress towards goals. So some ways to kind of assess if progress is being adequately monitored. We feel that progress monitoring should measure in specific areas of need. So each area of need in a student's IEP should be accompanied by an annual goal that's broken down into benchmark goals. Now, some IEP needs are not actually accompanied by a goal, and that's okay in some circumstances, but we often like to see needs being accompanied by goals in specific areas. So for instance, what I'm talking about is like reading comprehension is a need that a child has, and then there's a goal to go with it. We like to see these goals specifically monitored in the progress report, for each goal and each need. So the data should match that goal. Essentially, it shouldn't go rogue. It shouldn't measure some other goal. Shouldn't change the markers for determining if the student is making progress. It should essentially match the goal as stated. However, it should not simply copy the goal from the IEP verbatim and just copy and paste over and say that the student's making progress. We like to see detail. We don't want to see it word for word. And honestly, when I see this, I just don't trust it. I think that additional detail about how the student is getting to the goal, maybe the number of trials they did, how the data was collected, that kind of thing is really helpful and can provide a lot of beneficial information. Um, and then my final 2 points are related more towards the goals themselves, which would be found actually in the IEP. So we like for the goals, to be specific enough to be able to track progress. So we want the goals as written in the IEP to lend themselves to good progress reporting. Um, so we have a couple of examples that I included in the slides, but I recognize that you all can't see them. So I will read one, just so I don't bore you too much, but I think it's important to kind of have a little bit of a guide to what you might want to be looking for when you're reviewing your student's IEP. So our first example is as follows. Given a preferred topic, the student will create a 3-paragraph essay that includes at least 5 sentences in each paragraph, an introduction, 2 to 3 facts, and a conclusion receiving a 4 on the rubric scale, with these criteria being met in 4 out of 5 trials. So the things I like about this goal is that it's quantified and we're able to see if the student met various factors. So, they either included the 2 out of 3 facts or they did not. They either scored a 4 on the rubric or they did not, and they either met it 4 out of 5 times or, some lesser value. And this makes it easy for us to be able to track and for teachers or whoever is monitoring progress to be able to track. When goals are left more vague, it's very difficult to kind of quantify the progress. So, like I said, I'm going to not bore you with my reading the second example. However, that first example is a little easier to be able to quantify because it is a more concrete goal. So, but there are other types of goals that we can also find ways to quantify for, such as a task initiation goal, an emotional regulation goal. Those kind of things can easily be adequately tracked as well. We just like to make sure that the goals are not written in a vague manner. So, when monitoring progress, districts will often consider adequate progress to be if a student is progressing toward a goal for the first 2 marking periods. So, if the progress report says that a student is progressing towards the goal rather than meeting the goal, that can be considered adequate progress because it's the beginning of the year, it's the first 2 marking periods, and they're kind of making their way there. The final 2 marking periods, we would really like to see that they are meeting that goal and they're getting to, meeting that goal, especially in that final marking period. So it's just something to kind of consider as you're reviewing your student's IEP. Progress reports. The next thing that I had to share with you all was an example of a progress report. We obviously cannot see that, and that's totally fine. One thing that I like to look for is that the progress report is specific, as I mentioned, and that it's broken up by goal. So we like to see each goal separately and under the specified need. As I mentioned earlier, we often like to see, how the data is being collected, who's collecting it, when it's being collected, and some more details. So these progress reports can be issued as often as necessary. We often see them quarterly, but if it needs to be done more frequently to be able to adequately assess a student's goals and how their needs are being addressed, that can absolutely be done. And it's something that, I think you can reach out and request. And, like Jackie said, within reason, I think it's something that can be met. So yeah, sometimes progress reports can even be embedded within the IEP. So another place to look out for them. But that's all I had to share on those.
Thank you. One of my things that I always try to tease out when I'm looking at a goal, and it kind of just reminded me when you were discussing that, Allison, is like, is it a multi-part goal? And if it is, do we have a measurement for each of the parts? So, for example, I often read goals that might say that like a student will, begin a task without refusal within 1 minute of being handed it, complete the task, and hand it in. Well, that's a lot of different things. And if I just get 70%, I don't know which part broke down. I don't know if it was because there was refusal in the beginning. I don't know if it was because the student completed it but then didn't hand it in. And so seeing, that they did this whole series with 70% accuracy tells us a lot less than if we had a different measurement for every one of those pieces. Because then you can see, okay, we're doing really well maybe on the beginning of the task, but we're not holding the attention for as long as it takes to complete a task. And then that might lend itself to changing the support. It might lend itself to revising the goal to really focus on the one piece that it is lacking. But when we try to measure everything together, then we're not really sure what is happening and where the breakdown is. Just because of the timing of this presentation, we wanted to talk a little bit about ESY next. ESY is extended school year services. That means services that go beyond the typical school year calendar. So in Pennsylvania, beyond the 180 days of instruction, and are according to the IEP. So it would be built into the IEP. It would be based on the students' special education and related services needs and goals, and are provided at no cost to families. The most typical way to see ESY is, probably about 5 weeks over the summer, in about, July to August range at one of the school district or charter school, typical locations. But there are a lot of different ways. And ESY, even though it is an area that I think is more prone to becoming, unfortunately, a little cookie cutter, it is needed to be as individualized as anything else that a student receives. So ESY needs to be individualized in terms of what the length and duration are for a student, in terms of what the student is receiving instruction in, and in terms of how that instruction is delivered, just like anything else for students with disabilities. It is not too late if you feel that your child should have qualified for ESY and you were told that your child did not. So yes, those eligibility determinations are usually made earlier in the year. In Pennsylvania, for students with severe disabilities who are in a group called the Armstrong group, that would have been a decision that's made in the February-March timeframe. For students who are not in the Armstrong group, there's no specific timeline, but it has to be, done timely so that families can exercise their rights if they have a dispute. In Pennsylvania, there are expedited due process hearings for extended school year disputes. And I want to kind of just spend a little bit of time on the factors that are supposed to be considered. I think most people are really familiar with the discussion around regression and recoupment, but those are not the only factors. So there are seven factors that need to be reviewed, and ways that a student can qualify for extended school year services. And regression and recoupment are only two of them. So regression is looking at what happens when a student has breaks in their education. Are they losing critical skills during that? Often schools will say, we need to look at our data. We have to look at what happened over the holiday break. We have to look at what happened over, spring break, if there was any regression there. And the recoupment is the kind of the opposite side of the coin, in that, how long does it take to regain skills? We know that over summer, all students are going to lose some of these skills that they had learned in the previous year. But for students with disabilities, we need to be really concerned with the amount of time that it's going to take them at the start of the next school year to regain those skills. So it is really critical that if there is regression and recoupment issues, that, ESY is meant to address that. Some other things that can qualify for ESY, though, are things like interruption of potential master skills. So if your school year is kind of ending right at the point of about to master a very critical skill, that is a reason why ESY could be appropriate. It can also be appropriate based on achieving self-sufficiency and independence, especially when a skill or behavior is critical to self-sufficiency. So that may be really looking at some of those adaptive skills, those skills that are needed in everyday life to take care of yourself, to function, to have independence from caregivers. And we can also look at what the the impact is of withdrawing from academics for the student. So if this is a student who has typically really struggled with something like perhaps with attendance issues and school avoidance, and a lot of that was based on not wanting to do academic work, and then suddenly we're getting great momentum, we don't want to go a whole summer then of not having those academic demands. Their point is that there are a number of different ways that students can qualify. So if you've been told that your child does not qualify and you feel that he or she should, one, it's not too late to continue that discussion. Two, there are dispute resolution options that are available to you. We will discuss those at the end of the presentation. And three, regression and recoupment are not the only ways that students qualify for extended school year services. When students do receive extended school year services, just like with the progress monitoring that Alison was talking about, you really want to see that there is data being collected and that you can receive that at the end. So that's another kind of one of those periods that sometimes I find that it is more difficult for families to stay in the loop. There may be different teachers than they're used to, and the schedule is kind of very different than the typical school year, and sometimes they just don't get all of the information. But following up over the summer or at the beginning of the school year to get that data could be really important. It's going to help tweak the IEP if needed in the beginning of the school year, and it may help you plan for ESY the following year if you notice, for example, that the amount of services provided was not sufficient to really prevent regression and recoupment at the beginning of the year. That may be a reason to say that the following year's program needs to be more intensive. And then finally, I'd mentioned dispute resolution. There's just a few things that I always want to leave families with, just so that they know their rights. So there is a 2-year statute of limitations. So if you feel that your child's rights have been violated in the past, generally speaking, you have 2 years to act upon that and to a due process complaint to allege that violation. It's really important that, if you felt that your child identified earlier, or that, the student, there was some significant event in the past, that you let those 2 full years go by, because you waive your ability to act upon that in the future. Types of remedies that they can get when they have a dispute can include things like improved services for their child, services in the least restrictive environment, independent educational evaluations, tuition, and payment for educational expenses. So all things that may, really look at your child's needs and disability and provide support, particularly if it wasn't provided in an appropriate way in the past and your child unfortunately did not make sense. There are ways to help. In Pennsylvania, we have the Office for Dispute Resolution. It several services that families can avail themselves of, including facilitated IEP meeting, where a facilitator will come and try to, collaborate between the two parties and move the conversation to a more productive end. Mediation, where a mediator can be assigned. That can be done with counsel, without counsel. And then due process hearings, where families can pursue any of those remedies that we previously talked about if they felt that there is a violation. Families can be represented by counsel, and I would recommend that if going to a due process hearing, they should be represented by counsel if possible. And in our office, we do free 1-hour consultations. It includes a review of your child's educational records. So if you have any concerns, or you just feel like maybe it would be good to have an extra set of eyes on it, feel free to contact us, and we'd be more than happy to take a look. That includes if your child has not been identified yet and you just have concerns. You're just getting report card grades that seem too low. You're getting behavioral notices, attendance concerns, just something that doesn't seem right to you, and you want to know if there is a way to help address it. We'd be more than happy to take a look for you. So thank you. Thanks for bearing with us through some technical glitches. I did put our email addresses in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out to either Alison or I directly. We'd be happy to connect with you, and we'd also be happy to send you a copy of the slides that unfortunately we're not able to be seen tonight.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to mention that I do see one question in the chat. So I'll just address that before we log off here. So the question says, for high school students with an IEP, do they have both report cards and IEP progress monitoring reports? And absolutely yes. For a student with an IEP, no matter their age, the IEP goals should be monitored through the progress report. Like I said a little bit earlier, I would also check embedded in the IEP. It's possible that there are some reports included there. But I also think, if you're not seeing them, it's fine to reach out and just ask where you can view them.
Yeah, any of your child's teachers or if a case manager should be able to point you in the right direction because you should be regularly getting those progress reports to review.
Awesome. And that's all I see for now. I'm okay to hang on a couple minutes to see if anyone has any other questions.
Yes, the question is, can a student 1 year post-graduation still ask for compensatory education? Yes. So that's where that 2 year statute of limitations is really important because graduation in this scenario would be 1 year back. You don't want to wait for 2 years back, but yes, this is still something that is a potential remedy for a student post-graduation, compensatory education specifically. Certain things like, changing the IEP wouldn't be possible anymore, but compensatory education, which is a fund that could be used for educational expenses to catch a student up for the services he or she should have had in the past, is absolutely still available, and time is of the essence. We have a question here about a progress report showing a percentage, but not raw data. That's definitely a conversation I think to have if the percentage is not conveying enough information for you to be able to follow whether progress is really being made. Then the data itself would absolutely be something reasonable to request. Presumably it's being taken anyway, so I don't see why that should be problematic or taxing to share. And so if it's being taken in a way that makes more sense to you, like for example, it might be, how many behaviors are occurring. I'm not saying that this is your scenario, but sometimes it's easier to see how many behaviors are occurring rather than a percentage of the day without behaviors or something along those lines. If there is a way that the data will make more sense to you and will be more accurate for the discussion, that's absolutely something that can be requested. You'd want the goal itself to be rewritten so that the data you get in the progress monitoring matches the goal that is written in the IEP. So we received a question. I think what the question is asking is when a student is denied an IEP, but still in high school, can they receive compensation for previous school years? Yes, potentially. If there is a claim there, we would call that a child fine claim, that the school district or charter school evaluated the child but didn't find eligibility when they should have. And so, yes, there could be a claim for previous years based on what the student should have received and failed to.
And I am seeing requests come in for the slides. So we thank you so much for doing that. I'm glad you got our emails and we will certainly send those out um, following the presentation. Thank you.
Well, it looks like that might be it for the questions. Thank you so much for joining us and hopefully learning a little bit more about this. If we got your email, we'll absolutely be sending you the additional slides. If you have other questions, you can always feel free to contact us.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Take care.